Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Laban has been kind enough to ask me to introduce myself. My name is Robert Haas, and I work here. And now we come to the third evening of the series of faculty lectures on the dance. You will remember that in the first evening with Dr. Hawkins and Dr. Cannon, highlighted the fact that the dance cannot operate without sensitivity. Sensitivity on the part of the doer. And when Dr. Hawkins referred to this process, she referred to it as sensing, responding, and making. Dr. Cannon that first evening spoke about the conditioning of the infant by adults, and he gave this as a further example of how this sensitizing process works. The second evening, can you hear me? With Pia Gilbert and Dr. Kierans, explored the relationship between the mover or the doer in the dance and music. Here we had evidence of the effect upon the dancer of varied musical and sound accompaniments, and in addition of the effect of words upon the dancer, as well as the dancer's ability to extend that which he receives into a new made imagery of his own. Tonight we explored dance in its visible and visual dimensions with Juana Laban, professor of the dance, associate professor of the dance. One has to be very careful in this institution. And Oliver Andrews, associate professor of art. Dr. Laban will explore with us the relation of the mover to space, or space within the mover. And Mr. Andrews will then discuss with us how the visual arts, sculpture in particular, have dealt with space, and how in our time visual artists have extended the same concepts as those developed by Rudolf Laban, father of our Juana Laban, whose fascinating Icosahedron, I really think it's Icosahedron, but I'm not sure, she will describe to us. You see it here confronting you in all its splendor. Now to introduce Juana Laban. Miss Laban is, of course, the coordinator of this series, as you know. Some of you will remember her as the coordinator of last year's extension series, Panorama of Dance. At UCLA, she is a teacher of dance history. Do you hear this, Juana? Yes, sir. Dance theory, dance research, and she is internationally known as a choreographer, director of plays, author, and lecturer. Because of her family connection with the very famous father, Rudolf Laban, I am moved to introduce her by telling an anecdote recorded by Gertrude Stein of Edwin Dodge, who is reported to have said, "Lives of great men all remind us we should leave no sons behind us." Juana would certainly have made Edwin Dodge write another couplet, and perhaps he would have said, "Lives of great men all remind us we should leave no sons behind us, but if a child at all is thoughter, at least give thanks that it's a daughter." So both Rudolf Laban and I give you Juana.
Thank you so much. And to Dr. Haas, my thanks. I have never been welcomed in such a pleasant way. And ladies and gentlemen, dance and its visual dimension, we would like to look at man in space as an aesthetic consideration to the individual and his body from a realistic consideration to the reality of the dancer as he is inseparable from the space surrounding him. Space creates a place for the dance. The world of the dancer is to make space and body move and give it concrete meaning. The dancer occupies an empty space, and makes it a place alive with dancing. The body establishes his own movement laws in space according to direction, cutting across places, circling, winding paths, spiraling, a flat plane approach, etc. We also consider the body parts as specific things. We use them in a symbolic manner. For instance, we form a star with the hand, or we fold the arms in the sign of the infinite. The human body as a structure shows the manifold movement infinities. Technical structuring of movement will be evident in free or bound flow or its dematerialization. Geometric lines and figures in space assume a meaning and hence reveal content by the manner in which the movement is executed. Jean Erdmann, in her architectonic piece, The Castle, achieved a symbolic connotation arrived at by manipulation of space and objects. The objects, naturally, the moving dancers. Dance is the presentation of the beauty of structural forms, its shapes, its lines, its silhouettes of the moving body, something which modern choreographers try to do today. Particularly outstanding along that line is Merce Cunningham and Anne Halprin. Balanchine does also not use conventional content because the spatial tension and the dancing bodies create for him significant ideas. Laban discovered much what only in time will be known in reality, in art and the philosophy of the dance. The problem of structure of the body and space is a theme which Sartre and Merleau-Ponty particularly investigated. The plasticity of the movement in the world of space creates an image born of the collaboration of the brain and the body that shapes it. We have the capacity to execute real movement and make concrete the possible. That is what gives dance the visual dimension. Sybil Shearer works along this idea. Art is the mastery over chaos. Art of the dance is the mastery of ordered movement selected and translated into a pure vision of appearance. So much for the general characteristics of space in tonight's lecture. Now to my father. My father was a Hungarian and a cosmopolitan. By profession, a painter, an architect, and a choreographer. But when I traveled to Italy, in my passport was my father's profession. The custom man saw fit to erase choreographer and substitute geographer. And when I asked him, he said, there is no such profession, but there is a geographer, and I know that. One of the great theoreticians of dance, he contributed to the many areas of movement investigation, in addition to being a dancer and teacher of dance for almost 50 years. He departed from us in 1958. His most prominent invention, lava notation, is best known in the United States. His great sense of humor allowed him to view himself as historical. He attended a tea party when I last saw him in England, and when he came home from the tea party, he said to me that several young ladies were talking to him and were telling him all about himself and saying that he must get around to meet that very interesting man. And so he was very polite, and he said, "Thank you very much, I will do it." And at the end he said, "But we never introduced ourselves, so allow me to introduce myself," which he duly did. Now about the icosahedron and space harmony. Laban used a complex structure, a visible model, a space modulator, which is called the icosahedron, to study the movement possibilities, A, of the body in space, and B, space related to bodily movement. Structure in science is a synthesis, a system of different scales of order and disorder, in the same way that movement of the diverse body appears as order and disorder. I do not know whether you realize, but sometimes movements which we execute in the technique of another master are not the right movements for everyone to execute. And instead of having an ordered line of sequence as the movement was presented on the various bodies, it looks disordered or disorganized. Geometry of space and its functional organization is an old concept in the arts. So Laban thought to utilize this approach for the young mover. He found that with the aid of the icosahedron, its space harmony rules and laws could give purpose to rhythmic and dynamic movement invention, as well as stress spatial awareness in relation to shapes and lines the body is capable to create. The world is modular, says Philip Morrison in his essay on modularity of knowing. He feels we have to understand modularity, its visual and non-visual implication, and properly explore them. This, in my opinion, is what Laban tried to set forth in his work on space harmony. Here in the icosahedron, time, distance, and size in new challenging principles confront us. Motion, relativity, and chance are no longer strange to the dancer's exploration in choreography. These concepts have opened the range of visual dimensions considerably during the last decade. In conjunction with the icosahedron, we built a new environment of perception for the dance, which in turn fashions everything according to individual requirements. Space is only a form of our perception. Time is in the stream of our consciousness. And Merce Cunningham put a challenge before us when he said, quote, "The dance is an art in space and time. The object of the dancer is to obliterate that," unquote. This the dancer can do, however, only if he knows all about space and time in the first place. Therefore, in our demonstration, we shall highlight briefly some principles of movement orientation in space. Brooke Hunter and Gary Bates will assist me in this demonstration. First, the dancer in the icosahedron in his own kinesphere. The movement surrounding the immediate area of extension of the total body marks the kinesphere. We take this movement with us wherever we go. So the kinesphere surrounding goes with us, even when we project ourselves in the larger space. The interconnection between the body and the icosahedron shows the dimensions. Gary? In length, in depth, and in breadth. The center of the kinesphere is the axis where the dimensions meet the directions. And when you had this movement, so you see that the center is located approximately there. And we like to get for you the directions in the icosahedron, viewing frontward where they start and end, and sideward with Brooke on the outside. Very well. High and low and forward and back and right and left. Thank you. Now all of you are in this room in the form of a cube. And for the further movement extensions, we connect 3 corner lines of 3 different planes, and we will get the diagonals from the converging points, and I will call them out as the dancers will execute them. Brooke is going to do high, forward, right. And she's going to left, low, backward. And from high, backward, left, she's going to low, right, forward. Now we can naturally transfer these to the opposition, and now she begins in left, high, backward, to come to right, forward, low, and goes from high, left, forward, to right, back, low. Very well. Now, with these diagonals again, it is the best idea that you will mention each time these lines go through the axis of the center of your body. We naturally utilize levels, but in the dance, we like to think of creating levels. So we will utilize some opposition to what I am saying. High, low, and left or right. And with this tension, when 2 people move, you can see the intersection of the lines in the icosahedron much more strikingly. Now we also would like to have the lines between the dimensions and the diagonals, which are called diameters. And Gary will execute them in the icosahedron. There is a whole choice of them already, if we just take from up to down as he preferred to do it. But then there is in the other direction, in the oppositional, where we can end in the different sphere of this icosahedron, namely in the up plane. As you can see, the icosahedron gives tangible expression to what is already inherent in the human form. It manifests the anatomical potentiality of the body as a very fundamental concept. What is in the body is here used as a device, a teaching method to further extend movement, and you might call it a historical study of the body. Now we come to the next portion, which is space and the dynamosphere. All outer movement communicated by the dancer reveals an inner attitude which centers on the search and implication of gesture and motion in the dynamosphere. That space in which dynamic stress takes place is the dynamosphere. The interconnection of time and force, the intensity controlled in tension and or in weight, we like to illustrate. Movements of slashing. Good. Now we try to give the counterpart in terms of ballet in the fouetté. And Gary wanted me to say that he's not primarily a ballet dancer, but a modern dancer, but he consented to do it because he is trying to study the ballet. Now we take the gliding movement. Very nice. And in turn, the glissé. Thank you. Then beating. Do it again. Use your head for the third movement. There. Great. And the battu. Thank you. There is a contrast, as you can see, between modern and ballet technique by just a simple idea as this. And naturally, we could follow through more with that, but I thought you get an idea. It is evident that size plays a role in the expressive qualities of movement when considered in time and force. And Brooke is going to stay within her space by doing the next sequence of movement. Thank you. Gary is going to extend his movement into the beyond of the space in which we find ourselves. Thank you. In addition, the dancer visibly moves in a path and space rhythms of longs and shorts and presents a shape and mood, if, when utilized in choreography, can express a particular selected feeling or idea in movement. We can hence approach dance ideas from the inner attitude or from the outer spatial manifestation and psychologically arrive at the same intent. Gary is doing for us a path and space rhythm. The important thing in dance is that the emotional content is only recognized after the movement is completed. Shape and mood might best be demonstrated in contrasting or gathering movements which have a closing in quality. Gary? Next, we do the releasing or scattering movements, which generally open out. Get it? Now, with Gary, you saw, and I will ask him right away to do it again, there was an impulse in the movement of centrifugal characteristics and a launching into space. Muscular trace form and gesture line provide counterpoints. For instance, we take a particular limb for outer need of action, and gradually we see that it takes on a shape. Or there is the inner need of expression. That manifested itself in a certain kind of mood quality. The next sequence is very difficult for us to leave you with after we have done it, because it only marks the point of departure of the entire sequence sequence of movement learning in the icosahedron. But we start out with something what my father called the A scale. The A scale can be done naturally with different parts of the body. It can be done without the transfer of weight from one point to the other point and the positions. And when done with the transfer of weight, naturally it has a different quality in movement. This is the starting point. We are going to 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 and 12. So you see the axis, by doing it with the right portion of the body, has all the elements included which you have seen so far executed in this particular scale. Now when Brooke steps into the icosahedron, we are going to see what she is executing as the B scale. So while Gary is doing the A scale, you see the mirror picture in Brooke as designated as the B scale. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 and back to the starting position, or 12. Thank you very much. The scales offer aggressive and defensive movement qualities. While the A scale is called masculine and the B scale feminine, it does not necessarily mean that one is limited in choosing one or the other. The ballet strives for absolute balance in vertical control, while the modern dance destroyed this particular singular image. One more facet I like to have Brooke and Gary demonstrate, namely body perspective, which has implications for the individual movement style of a dancer. A straight line in sequence, again, in the icosahedron, you think of it from the front approach, and outside of it, we like to view it from the side. The straight line, the curved line, the twisted line, the round line. Fine. And now we like to try it with two people together. The straight line, the curved line, the twisted line, and the round lines. Thank you very much. The ballet achieved constancy of style as an expression. In the modern dance, it is form, which allows for individualistic expression. Inside the icosahedron, dynamic stress is extended, thrusting the energy beyond it, and the focal points serve only as guides to movement qualities, thereby facilitating expressive possibilities. The two dancers will now close, each with a short improvisation. Having had only a very brief exposure of the barest essentials of space harmony in the icosahedron, they were willing to try to make a study which summarizes together these components which we were trying to expose to you. Thank you very much, Brooke. Thank you, Gary. We know that seeing and doing are two very different things. So we recommend that you try and experience movement in the icosahedron at the end of the evening. Now I'm turning the program over to Dr. Haas again, so he may introduce our guest and fellow artist.
That was beautiful.
Was it good enough?
Oh, marvelous. Can you hear me telling how marvelous it was?
Thank you.
Beautiful. Do them all another big round. Great. Now, if you promise not to get up, we don't want to lose anybody at midstream. I'll ask you to breathe for a minute while we put up the screen. A deep breath. And I think he should have a round of applause, too. Now, here comes Oliver Anders. And about him, I want to say something very brief. He is one of America's most distinguished contemporary sculptors. That covers a lot of territory. Since 1960, he's exhibited in at least 8 one-man shows. Among his recent commissions are a series of bronze and marble fountains for houses designed by Richard Neutra here in our community. A monumental bronze fountain he did for the University of California campus at Riverside. And 2 of his works can be seen here on our own campus, one in the Sculpture Garden and the other in the Sunset Canyon Recreation Center. Oliver? Are you here? Fine. He will discuss with us the structural principles under... Now, I want to be sure you get this, Oliver, because this is what we want to hear. He will discuss with us the structural principles underlying motion and stability and illustrate with slides how the forms produced by many visual artists today are remarkably similar to those developed and discovered by Rudolf Laban. That this should happen to a distinguished sculptor. There.
Thank you. As I was looking at Gary standing in his last pose in the icosahedron there in this pose, I was very much reminded of that drawing of Leonardo da Vinci, which I'm sure you all know, of the man inside of a diagram which shows all of the proper and classical proportions of the human figure. And I think this kind of play between the figure and the natural kind of gesture it makes in dancing or in painting or in any other way in which it manifests motion. This play between the figure in this way and some kind of geometric structure, some kind of intellectual framework which can somehow explain and measure this kind of gesture. I think this dialogue between the organic and the structural has been playing back and forth ever since the beginnings of Western art. In certain periods, the structure is more important, and you get a more classical, more rigid, intellectual, mathematical, geometrical kind of art. At other times, you get a more fluid, more gestural, more perhaps emotionally loaded type of art. In our own day, these two poles that art is reflected from have become so combined and so close together that there is almost a fluctuation between them, and they exist now simultaneously, so that we see that they really are not different ways of thinking, but they are simply points of view which each illuminate the other, just as a snowbank is a soft, shifting kind of form, soft with curving forms. So if you look at it more closely, you begin to see snowflakes, which, as we know, are geometrical and precise and beautiful in their own way, but slightly different. Now, I'd like to show you some various works of art which reflect the interplay between these two kinds of vision, and I think they will also show that the ways in which dancers and choreographers think, the kind of art forms that they are making, are also ways in which painters think, and that there is a kind of a play of emotion and movement and gesture in all the arts, which stems from a kind of common purpose and common insight, but may be manifested now as dance, now as sculpture, now as painting, again as architecture. If we could have the lights down in the first slide, please. This is a gouache by a painter, Morris Graves, who worked on the northwest coast. And this is a painting of a bird singing in the moonlight. This, the dark bird in the center, can you focus? Is that focused as well as it can be? Yeah. This bird, of course, represents not only a bird, but the soul of man and the individuality of man. And here you see this bird producing around itself a kind of luminous structure composed of geometric shapes. It's almost producing by its song an aura, or a form which is very much like the icosahedron there, made out of wood, very much the same sort of thing as that represents, as a kind of symbolic framework around the individual. Let's see the next slide. Here are the same sort of thing. This is a bird in the fog, painted by Morris Graves, one of our great nature painters, and who made a long series of these birds. The birds really representing some kind of inner being of man. And here you see a bird in the fog, in which, again, around the bird there is a kind of luminous space created, which is in a way indicates the boundaries of the bird's perception. Just as I imagine a dancer who is used to dancing in the icosahedron, when he is not in the icosahedron, still has these imaginary lines around him. Next slide. This is one of Morris Graves' very well-known paintings called The Little-Known Bird of the Inner Eye. And here you see the bird in white inside this red crystalline rock-like structure, presented as being surrounded by a kind of crystalline structure which represents his aura or area of perception which goes beyond his body structure and beyond the consciousness of himself as being limited by the envelope of skin and feathers in which he lives. Next slide. Now, this is almost as though you took the bird away, you took the subject away, you took the perceiver away, and began to examine the structure of that aura, that live, that enlivened space which surrounds the bird. This is a painting by Mark Tobey, contemporary of Morris Graves. And here you see the whole canvas covered in a rather random way with a series of very small geometric facets, a kind of fog of luminous light, of tracks, of areas of sensitivity, but with no one central focal point. Of course, this type of composition is one of the important things that began happening in Western painting and really led to the large, all-over painted canvases which we see being painted so much today. Of course, it existed in other cultures, in Japanese and Chinese painting, but this is Tobey was one of the pioneer workers in expanding this kind of consciousness of the total canvas as a continuous but active field in which consciousness existed but without being focused. Next slide. Another Tobey. Here you see that the gestures are becoming a little freer, a little bit more determined by the kind of movements that the hand naturally makes rather than being described by some kind of pattern which the mind projects onto the canvas and which the hand then follows as the mind describes it. A bit looser, freer, more random, still all over. But the hand is beginning to assume its own autonomy. It's beginning to add its own gestural qualities to the idea which is being presented on the canvas. Next. Now this is a Jackson Pollock, and here you see the real dance of paint which is taking place all over the canvas. You see these looping, curving lines. These kinds of forms were described by Rudolf Laban as lemniscate forms, or rather curvy, loopy, rounded kind of forms, and he said that these are the kinds of gestures, the kinds of shapes which the human body naturally makes because of its articulation, because it's a complex assembly. The skeleton has many joints connected by many muscles, and the body tends to make these skating, loopy kinds of forms. And this kind of painting is made without any preconceived plan. There is no set pattern, no set composition which the painter is trying to execute, but he simply starts with the paint and relies on his own intuition, his own sensitivity to lead him to the end of the canvas. And so in a way, the painting is as much a record of an event as it is an object which has been painted. That's why it's called, or one of the reasons why it's called, action painting. And in a way, the artist throws himself open to all the dangers of a live performance, as it were, because he doesn't have a preconceived plan, and so it makes his decisions and his spontaneity all the more crucial in whether the work is a success or a failure. Next slide. This is a close-up of the paint in that last painting. I'm sure any of you who saw that very large retrospective of Jackson Pollock's work, which has just been at the Los Angeles County Museum on its way all around the world, are more familiar with this quality of paint and this kind of lyric way of approaching the task of painting than these slides can show you. But here again you see the differences in thickness of paint, the differences in quality of texture. You see some very rhythmic looping lines, on the other hand some rather violent staccato splashings that take place. They're very much the kinds of gestural qualities that Miss de Laban was describing and illustrating in the Icosahedron with the beating and slicing and swooping and gathering motions which the dancers were doing. Next slide. Again, a large pollock, which shows us gestural qualities. Not very good color in this slide. Next slide. A close-up again. See that long sweeping line? These other rhythmic lines interspersed there. A dance done with paint, in other words. Next slide. This is another action painter. This is a painting by Klein. Here only very dark colors are used, some grays, mostly black and white, which accentuates the calligraphic gestural quality of the painting. Next painting, next slide. Another Klein. Here there is a combination of a geometrical understructure in the sense that there are lines and squares, but at the same time the gestural quality is very evident in the way the paint is put on. And you have here the resulting picture is almost like what you might get if you painted with a large paintbrush a certain pattern of choreography, a certain plan of choreography as seen from above. There are certain tracks, certain motions described, certain areas where there is more going on than less, and squares and closures which might enclose certain crucial places of action. Next slide. Another Klein. Actually, this is on its side, in which almost two figures are described in terms of their gestural qualities, so that each one seems to have a kind of different character, which is described by the kind of energy and the kind of motion the painter puts into it. Next. Now let's shift from painting into a manifestation of movement as it has been done by some sculptors. Here, instead of the arm and the hand and the paintbrush forming the movement, and you're seeing the paint as what is left afterwards, you have Alexander Calder making actual sculptures which move in space. And you might say that in designing this sculpture and thinking how it will move, he is, in a sense, choreographing the sculpture. We really should have a movie, or better yet, the sculpture itself. But any of you who have seen Calder's know the rhythmic and almost hypnotic effect that these works have as they move to the slightest breath of air or motion. And there are many, many joints in this, so of course it moves in many different ways. Next slide. Another Calder. So that, in a sense, we are creating sculptures, objects, which dance. Now, the Calders are relatively simple as far as the mechanics of their movement are concerned, and everything is more or less orbital in its quality of movement. In other words, everything hangs from the top pivot, and then other things pivot from their pivots, and so on and so on. But everything goes around, or things go around other things which go around. But there are much more complicated types of movement which are being worked with. Next slide. Here Calder is introduced. This is the mobile down at the Los Angeles County Museum, which is actuated by streams of water playing against it, so that another medium is being used here. Next. Now this is a work by. Could you turn this around? It's on its side. It should be straight up and down. No, it should be vertical rather than horizontal. Okay. Now you're looking up at this mobile, or actually kinetic sculpture. We should use George Ricky's own word for his own work, which is composed of many, many of these little blades, all pivoted in a very, very complex, double-jointed manner, and of such delicacy that the slightest breath of wind, almost the vibration of cars in the street outside, causes it to move. And it doesn't move simply in a seesaw or a circular motion like a cauldron does, but there is a kind of lilting and waltzing and gradually undulating quality to it, because some sections move as whole sections, and within them there are many small subsidiary movements, so that you get a movement which is much more like natural movement, which is complex, where there are many movements combined to make the total movement. When a tree moves, it doesn't just go back and forth, but it moves in a rhythmic wave-like quality, which is a result of the sum of all the tiny, small movements in it. So although the elements that you see, their shapes are geometric, the movement is much more complex. Next slide. Here we have a George Ricky, which is based on an idea of water plants. These little propeller-like things spin. They wobble on their axes, and the whole sculpture as a whole rocks back and forth. Next slide. This is Jean Tinguely, or Tinguely as he's often called, who has motorized sculpture, but rather than the motor driving the sculpture in a very rigid and mechanical fashion, the motors are designed so that they work in a rather rickety and not very reliable way, and sometimes they break down and have to be repaired. And there's a kind of pathos of the machine in Tinguely's work, where you feel that you're doing the machine a great favor by reaching over and making a connection for it again. And this is very total all media type of work, in that this part up here is a dismembered radio, which works in a random fashion, so that as well as the machine moving, it plays its own music, but in a rather random fashion, just plays back and forth across the dial any way it wants to. Next slide. Next. Now this is a machine which requires some spectator participation. These long, it's sort of like the jointed metal strands in front of Italian cafe. They're all jointed, and when the spectator steps on the button at the bottom, a rack at the top moves back and forth and introduces this sine wave, this wave, sort of hula skirt type action in the curtain, and it swings back and forth as long as you keep your foot on the button. And whether you want to dance with it is up to you. Next slide. This is a Marc de Souveraud, and this is from his exhibition at Douane Gallery last year. Here again, you see this combination, this integration of the geometric and conceptual along with the organic and natural. Here you see these tree trunks, which have been carved in a very rough fashion, but they are combined with structural elements which enable them to swing around in the air, so that in a way that the weight which you usually associate with a tree trunk is relieved of gravity and is able to rotate, to spin around through the air. These pieces of Marc de Souveraud also, most of them are built so that you can hang on to them or ride in them or on them in some way, so that the spectator is incorporated into the work as a participant. Next slide. Here you see the work you just saw, and then in the background a larger work. This is a bed which you can lie on and swing around with the sculpture. Notice that the whole idea of a sculpture as an object over there, which you look at sitting on a pedestal, the whole idea of the sculpture there and the spectator here is completely exploded in this idea. There is no one place where the sculpture is, but it's all over. It's in the air, it's behind you, it's above you, it moves, you move with it. And this reflects, I think, very much the kind of environment in which we find ourselves today, and recapitulates and at the same time gives form to many of the kinds of experiences which we all undergo. Now, in contrast to this kind of organic gestural painting and this kind of sculpture which retains a great, you might say, affection for natural forms, there are people working simultaneously in ways which still are extremely geometric and controlled. Next slide. This is a Richard Lippold made of stainless steel and silver wire, and I think you can see almost that if you take the idea of the icosahedron and go from that idea, from that conception of man's structural aura, and make that into a sculpture, you come up with something like this Lippold. Next slide. Another Lippold, this one made of gold wire. Very, very thin, almost diaphanous, depending largely for its visibility even on the presence of light. Next slide. Now if we move into the realm of architecture, we see the same kind of thing in the work of Buckminster Fuller in his geodesic domes, which, as a matter of fact, are based on tetrahedrons and icosahedrons. The same idea that Rudolf Laban found to be the underlying principle of the organization of the movement of the human body, Buckminster Fuller found on his own side that this was one of the underlying structures of nature, and that man, by using this in an intelligent way, could create totally new kinds of buildings and new kinds of structures which depended for their integrity not on weighing down and pressing on the earth and on compression, but on tension, on the idea of stretching thin strands of steel and making joints which had an inherent stability. And out of this then comes this very beautiful luminous kind of structure. Next slide. This is looking straight up into the top of a Buckminster Fuller dome. I think the connection between this and what you see next to it is obvious. Now, if we contemplate this type of form and realize that it's a form which is not only product of man's brain, but which underlies a lot of the formation of nature, we can see that just as a snowflake is only a momentary picture of what's going on in nature, that this form, if it changes only slightly, if it, say, becomes more amorphous, if it begins to move, to curve, and to change in any way, will immediately be recognizable as many other kinds of forms which maybe we haven't connected with this. Next slide. So we go back to a Jackson Pollock, and we see that in this kind of all-over pattern, in this kind of using of thin lines of high energy shooting across space and creating a kind of network of energy through which small points lead into the void beyond, we see that really there's a great deal of similarity between the structure of Buckminster Fuller and the organic gesture of Jackson Pollock, although at first we may not make that kind of connection. Next slide. And back again to Morris Graves. From that structure, then, we can begin to identify centers. And within that field, we can begin to find the individual person who is caught in that field or producing that field, just as once we understand the aura around the dancer, we always come back again to the individual dancer. Next. Now, in distinction to the architecture that you just saw, say that of Buckminster Fuller, which is beautiful as it is a product of a structurally thinking mind and is the result of taking certain kinds of calculations and intuitions to their ultimate expression. There's another kind of architecture which combines these two things in a gestural way and creates, this is the Cathedral of Ronchamp, designed by Le Corbusier. And here you have a kind of form which must be based on the kind of intelligent architectural structure which is necessary to build buildings, but which has a kind of total form which can only be conceived by an architectural gesture, as it were, by conceiving the building whole within the mind. Next slide. Rudolf Laban said that one of the highest functions of the human mind was to be able to see the invisible path of choreographic thought, to be able to feel choreography within the body. In other words, to see the shape of a dance as it is totally, not as divided up into individual moments. So in a sense, this kind of building can't be built out of pieces, and it can't be built out of flat plans. It has to be totally conceived as an architectural gesture inside a man's mind. Next slide. And we see that also this kind of building, as it relates to the scale of human beings, becomes a kind of theater or a kind of stage in which they can act, because their own scale and their own kinds of gestures, the kinds of things they do, are related to the forms and shapes of the building. Next slide. You see this very clearly in this little outside altar here, where services can be given outside. But there's a sculptural quality to this wall. Also, there is a very careful relationship to human scale and a very careful thought about what kind of actions are contained within the forms of this building when it's working, when something is happening. Here, it seems to be ready for something to take place. Next slide. And in this last slide, you see the inside of Ronchamp. You see the beautiful way in which that big curved roof goes off into those clear-story windows. You see the very stage-like quality of this area in which is arranged for the Mass to take place here, with the altar here, and so on. But with these lights and this whole feeling makes a kind of setting for a dramatic action to happen. And so you see in works like these, which combine both structure and feeling and a sense of motion, the possibility of combining many arts into one larger art. One thing that this reminds me of is the exhibition of the work of Gordon Craig, which is now taking place over in the research library. When you see a man like Gordon Craig, a man with a great overall vision of the unity of dance and drama and theater, and his own work is providing a setting for this to take place. So with this last slide, which I think demonstrates beautifully the coming integration of all aspects of the arts into one dramatic form, I will leave you with those thoughts for today. Thank you.